My name is Barbara Streisand. I'm 38 years old, a residential interior architect based in Portland, Oregon. And at the time those words were said to me, I had just paid $9,300 in household expenses over the past month alone, not including the emotional toll of living with a family that had long stopped recognizing my boundaries. The irony wasn't poetic, it was just painful. You don't expect to be exiled from your own home by the very people you once tried to rescue. A year earlier, my life looked very different. I had just completed a design contract for a boutique hotel on the Oregon coast, a career high that earned me recognition in regional trade magazines and 3 new client referrals. I had recently bought a 2-story Scandinavian-style house on the east side of Portland. It wasn't massive, but it had clean lines, large windows, and a kind of quiet sophistication that matched my personality. My office overlooked the backyard, and I often started my mornings with jazz, coffee, and blueprints laid out like quiet puzzles on my desk. I had built this life from scratch. No trust fund, no cosigner, no partner, just long nights, high standards, and enough patience to walk away from clients who didn't respect the creative process. Family, for me, had always been a more complicated subject. My father passed when I was 21, and my mother, Gwen, changed after that. She had always been strong-willed, but grief hardened her edges. Our phone calls became shorter, her tone clipped. My younger brother Lucas had always been the golden child, charming, creative, unmoored. He bounced between jobs, relationships, and half-started business ventures like someone allergic to stability. When Mom lost the condo she and Dad had shared due to a long legal battle over unpaid property taxes, I was the first person she called. Lucas didn't answer. I remember standing in my new kitchen, hand still wrapped around a coffee mug, as she told me in her usual emotionless voice. They're locking it up next week. Lucas says he's looking for options, but I can't wait around. Do you have space? It wasn't a question. Not really. At first, I told myself it would be fine. I cleared out my guest room, rearranged my office so it could double as storage for their things, and even added shelves in the garage. Mom moved in first, her boxes neatly labeled. Lucas arrived 2 days later with 3 duffel bags and a large gaming chair. Just until I sort a few things out, he promised, setting up his monitor on my dining table without asking. Nina, his girlfriend of 6 months, started staying over soon after, though neither of them officially acknowledged that she had moved in. One morning I found her robe hanging in my bathroom. The next week she began receiving packages at my address. For the first month, I tried to play along. I'm good at pretending things are fine. It's a survival skill you pick up in creative industries. We had a shared grocery system. I handled the mortgage, property tax, internet, water, electricity, and trash. They said they would contribute soon. Lucas was freelancing remotely, he claimed, and Nina was between contracts. Mom promised she'd pick up groceries, but mostly she rearranged my cabinets and bought obscure health supplements with my Costco card. The kitchen stopped feeling like mine. Then the living room did. Then, eventually. Even my bedroom felt invaded when I came home to find Mom sitting on my bed folding laundry she had no business touching. I began working late, finding reasons to stay at the office or schedule client meetings that ran well into the evening. When I voiced concern about privacy, about costs, about the simple fact that this was supposed to be temporary, the responses came fast and familiar. "You've changed," Lucas said once, when I asked him to move his workstation off my dining table. "You used to be chill. You used to be family." Mom, arms crossed at the top of the staircase, added, "You act like we're strangers. You didn't even flinch when your father died. Now you can't even tolerate your own blood under one roof." It was always like that. Every boundary I tried to draw got turned into a character flaw. Then came the quiet, slow destruction of my work. Nina had borrowed my tablet one afternoon while I was in a Zoom meeting. She left it on the couch. The dog from the neighbors somehow got inside, still don't know how, and chewed through the screen. Lucas shrugged. "It's just a tablet. Don't you have, like, 3 of those?" When I told him I needed that one for client renders, He rolled his eyes and said I was overreacting. That became the tone of everything. If I asked for respect, I was dramatic. If I asked for help, I was being manipulative. If I pulled back, I was cold. And if I dared remind anyone that this was my house, I was selfish. The bills mounted. Groceries alone tripled. My water usage spiked with all the extra showers and laundry. Lucas started using my car when his battery died. Nina hosted a birthday party for a friend in my home office without asking, pushing my equipment to the side like an afterthought. I began tracking everything, not out of spite, but survival. That's how I know I spent $9.03 in 1 month. That's how I know the utilities alone crossed $700. That's how I know I was funding 4 adults with 1 salary and the only one losing sleep over it was me. But none of that stung like that morning at breakfast. I had just gently asked if we could set a new timeline for them to find a place. I'd even researched some rentals, printed out options, tried to sound helpful, not demanding. That's when my mother, the woman I had moved mountains for, looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you don't like living with family, you can leave." And just like that, my house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battleground I was losing one quiet compromise at a time. That morning, I left the house without saying a word, drove to the outskirts of town, parked near a trailhead I hadn't visited in years. I sat in silence with my windows down, trying to remember the last time I felt like my life was mine. I couldn't. All I knew was this something had to change. Not next month, not after one more conversation. Now. I didn't go back home until after dark. I drove past the street twice before finally turning into the driveway. Headlights cutting across the blinds of my own bedroom like I was an intruder. Inside, the house was loud. Lucas laughing over some late-night show. Nina on speakerphone with someone named Marla. Mom clattering dishes in the kitchen with that passive-aggressive energy she wore like perfume. No one noticed I was late. No one asked where I had been. I watched from the threshold for a moment, then walked up the stairs without a word. That was the first night I locked my bedroom door. The thing about losing control of your space is that it doesn't happen all at once. It erodes quietly. You adjust a little here, compromise a little there, until one day you realize the couch isn't where you left it. Your wine glasses have been replaced by tumblers from a dollar store, and the silence you once loved has been drowned out by the hum of other people's routines. That week, I began collecting pieces of myself. Not physically yet, but mentally. I started listing things, not just expenses, but memories. The things that had changed since they moved in, the rituals I had let go of, the boundaries I had once thought were unspoken but apparently needed contracts and signatures. At work, I kept things together just well enough. My client, Harold Kim, was finalizing a second resort project and had asked me to submit concept boards by the end of the month. It should have been a career-defining moment. Instead, I found myself nodding through meetings, distracted by missed packages, noise complaints from the HOA, and the quiet dread of knowing that Nina had started using my office while I was gone. "It's just easier with your chair," she said one evening, chewing pistachios over my render desk. Crumbs dusting the leather like sawdust. "You should do this full time. Your setup's amazing." Lucas promised to talk to her. He didn't. Instead, the next morning, I found she had logged into my work laptop to stream something and forgotten to log out. My files had been rearranged. One of my folders, the one marked Harold, Blue Ridge Project, was open, its contents untouched but exposed. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I just stood there, quietly shaking, the kind of shaking that doesn't come from rage, but from a deep, buried disbelief that this is your life now and no one even thinks they're doing anything wrong. I called Lydia that night. She had been my best friend since undergrad. She'd seen me through bad bosses, worse clients, and the breakup I swore I'd never talk about again. I hadn't told her the full story yet, just bits and pieces. But that night it came spilling out. Every expense, every broken item, every casual disrespect. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line. Then she said, "Barbara, They're not just using you, they're erasing you. I laughed, bitter and exhausted. You think I don't know that I think you forgot what it feels like to matter in your own life, she said quietly, and I think it's time you remembered. The next morning, I started small. I moved the guest towels back into the linen closet. Not Nina's new ones, mine. I replaced the cheap coffee with my usual espresso blend. I rearranged the living room back to how it had been before subtle things. But intentional. It didn't take long for the shift to be noticed. Someone's territorial this week. Mom said over breakfast, "Don't worry, we'll make it cozy again soon." I didn't respond. I just picked up my keys and left. That afternoon, I met with Harold Kim. It was a quiet lunch at a rooftop bar he preferred, the kind of place where small decisions carried million-dollar implications. I showed him my sketches. He nodded slowly, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're distracted." I didn't try to deny it. "Yes." I said simply, "Family stuff?" He studied me for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he said, "I don't care about your personal life. Barbara, but if I'm going to give you a second property, I need your full mind in the room. Can you give me that?" I paused. "I will." And I meant it. I just didn't know how yet. That evening, I sat in my car again, this time, in the grocery store parking lot with a rotisserie chicken and a bottle of wine sweating beside me. I didn't cry. I wasn't sad. I was calculating. Because what no one tells you is that before you take your power back, you lose it in slow motion. You give it away in kindness, in silence. In every moment, you convince yourself that keeping the peace is more important than protecting your peace. But eventually, something changes. A click, a decision, a refusal to shrink. That's where I was now. I began documenting everything: photos of the house, bills with timestamps, texts, call logs, not because I planned to take legal action yet, but because I needed to remember I wasn't imagining it. Gaslighting doesn't always come from romantic partners. Sometimes it comes from the people who once rocked you to sleep. I called my old real estate attorney, Sandra, under the guise of updating property records. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. I called my financial advisor, Melanie, to reevaluate my portfolio. Again, not a lie, just a soft pivot in preparation for something bigger. Meanwhile, the house continued as if nothing had changed. Nina threw a backyard dinner for her friends one Saturday, complete with twinkle lights and borrowed tableware, Lucas said. "It's just one night. Chill." My mother invited her church group over and used my kitchen like a showroom. No one asked. They just moved through the space like it belonged to them. But this time, I didn't internalize the resentment. I stored it, like kindling, like fuel, because they thought I was tired. And I was. But not in the way they assumed. I wasn't tired from too much conflict. I was tired from too much silence. And that, more than anything, is what they were going to learn. The shift started small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't watching closely. I didn't announce anything. I didn't slam doors or make speeches. That wasn't my style. Instead, I began creating distance with quiet precision. I left earlier for work. I stayed later at the studio. I scheduled meetings that took me out of the house during key times so I could avoid the tension that always brewed around dinner. I moved valuables slowly, methodically into a safety box at the bank. My grandmother's bracelet, the original sketches from my first award-winning project, the contract folder for Harold's second property, items that couldn't be replaced. I packed them carefully and stored them away without a word. At first, no one noticed. Mom was too busy micromanaging the kitchen layout again. Lucas was in his own world, applying to jobs with questionable effort and playing video games like they were oxygen. Nina had started bringing home clients for her freelance PR work, setting up meetings in my sunroom and serving them drinks from my cabinet. When I came home one Thursday and found her pouring from my anniversary reserve of Amarone bought 5 years ago to celebrate my first independent project, I didn't say a word. I just watched, and I logged it. It wasn't about the wine, it was about the entitlement. The assumption that because I hadn't said no, everything was a yes. I began locking my bedroom again, not out of fear, but out of preservation. I noticed things going missing: a necklace, a memory card. My mail was opened on the counter twice. Nina said it must have been a mix-up. Lucas blamed the delivery service. Mom didn't acknowledge it at all, but the worst part wasn't the items. It was the slow unraveling of my sense of safety in a house I had poured my soul into. Meanwhile, Harold was losing patience. I missed one minor deadline and he called it out in front of 2 colleagues. "Is everything all right?" "Barbara," he asked, voice calm but cold. "This isn't like you." I smiled, made excuses, promised to deliver better next week. But he wasn't wrong. I wasn't operating at full strength anymore. My creativity had dulled under the weight of household chaos. I couldn't focus in my own space. My sanctuary had become an unpaid co-living experiment I never signed up for. Lydia kept checking in. "How long are you going to keep letting them do this?" she asked one night as we walked through an art exhibit downtown. I shrugged. "I'm not ready to fight." "Then don't fight," she said, stopping in front of a painting that looked like a woman walking away from a burning house. "Just leave." The words echoed louder than they should have. It felt wrong to even consider, but maybe wrong was just the name I had given things I was afraid to do. 2 weeks later, the tipping point arrived quietly. I came home early after a last-minute cancellation with a supplier. The house was silent. That should have been my first warning. As I walked upstairs, I noticed the office door open. Inside, Nina sat at my desk, screen glowing, talking to someone via video call. "We've mocked up 5 layouts so far," she was saying, gesturing at my sketches. "It's my vision board, but I'm working closely with a top-tier architect. You'll love the aesthetic." I stepped into the room without speaking. She turned, her face flushed, but only for a second. "Oh, hey," she said, brushing her hair back like this wasn't a violation. "Just showing a sample to a potential collab. You weren't using this file, were you?" That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a single light on, scrolling through job boards not for myself, but for them. I compiled listings for affordable housing. I ran numbers with Melanie again. I called Sandra the next morning. "What are my options if they won't leave?" I asked plainly. Her voice was calm, factual. "You own the home outright. They are guests. If you provide written notice with a reasonable timeline, typically 30 days, you are well within your rights. But you'll need documentation, paper trails, evidence that this was never intended as a permanent living arrangement." I had all of it: emails, texts, voice memos. I just needed to act. The house, meanwhile, had started to sour. Tension was building. My coolness didn't go unnoticed. Mom started making pointed remarks. "It's like walking on eggshells around here," she said once while chopping celery. Lucas began slamming cabinets. Nina stopped greeting me altogether. One morning, I found a handwritten list on the fridge titled "Things Barbara Could Do to Lighten Up." It included suggestions like compliment Nina more often and join family dinners at least twice a week to improve morale. I didn't say anything. I just took a photo of it for my folder. Then the job offer came. Not for me, ironically, for Lucas. A mid-sized design firm I'd done consulting for years ago had an opening for a junior tech position. They had found his profile through a connection and reached out directly. I saw the email. He dismissed it instantly. "The salary's insulting," he said, waving it off. "I'm not going to work for peanuts just because they need help." I stared at him, speechless. He hadn't contributed a cent in over 5 months. Hadn't bought groceries, hadn't paid for gas despite borrowing my car, and now, faced with a chance to earn something, to take pressure off the very sister funding his lifestyle, he declined because it didn't meet his self-inflated standards. That evening, I drafted the letter. It was simple, professional, and factual. A 30-day notice to vacate the property, signed and dated. I included a printed spreadsheet of my out-of-pocket expenses for the past 6 months. I made a folder of Housing Resources real listings, not theoretical, and I printed 3 copies, one for each of them. I didn't deliver it that night. I wasn't ready yet, but it sat on my desk like a loaded decision. I would give them one last weekend, one final window to redeem this situation, and if they didn't take it, I'd take back everything. Because there's a quiet kind of power in knowing the line has been crossed, not in anger, not in rage, but in certainty, the kind that doesn't shake or shout, it just moves. Saturday morning arrived quiet and gray, a Portland kind of silence, like the sky was holding its breath. I brewed my coffee slower than usual, letting the hum of the machine fill the room as I rehearsed what I was going to say. I had imagined it a dozen different ways, me calm and professional, them stunned and maybe even grateful for the clarity. That version never happened. Instead, Lucas beat me to the conversation with a declaration that blindsided all three of us. "I've decided to start a design consultancy," he announced over breakfast. Like it was already a done deal. Nina's going to handle the branding. Mom's going to help with admin stuff. We're going to build something real. I've already been working on a pitch deck. I looked up from my coffee slowly. With what capital, I asked. Tone neutral. "We'll bootstrap," he said with a grin. "Honestly, it just makes sense to work from here for a while. The energy is good. We've got space. It's central. Clients would love this environment." I didn't speak. I couldn't, because what I realized in that moment was not just that he had no intention of leaving, but that he had begun building a life inside my walls without even acknowledging they were mine. My office, my studio lighting, my design samples, my printer, my network, all casually folded into some delusion where he was the visionary and I was, apparently, the invisible benefactor. I excused myself before I said something I couldn't take back. I walked for over an hour, no destination in mind, just movement. I passed the local bakery where I used to sit every Sunday morning and sketch ideas. I passed the bookstore where I'd found the coffee table that started my second career phase. I passed pieces of my old life like they were exhibits in a museum. All the while, one thought kept looping in my head. If I don't draw the line now, I will vanish from my own story. When I came home, the living room had been rearranged again. My minimalist mid-century layout had been pushed aside to make room for Lucas's work table. Wires snaked across the floor. Mood boards lined the wall, and my framed magazine cover had been turned around to make space for one of Nina's vision boards. My stomach dropped, not because of the mess, but because of what was missing my original rendering of the Blue Ridge client pitch. It wasn't in its frame. It wasn't on the shelf. It wasn't anywhere, I asked calmly. "Has anyone seen the Blue Ridge concept board that was in this room?" Lucas shrugged. "Nina took it to show one of her brand contacts. She said it would help them understand our visual language." I felt the heat rise behind my eyes. "That board belongs to a private client under NDA," I said. My voice low but firm. Using it without consent could jeopardize the contract. Lucas blinked. "It's just for inspiration. No one's stealing anything." I didn't respond. There was no point. That night, I pulled the folder from my drawer, the 30-day notice to vacate, the breakdown of expenses, the real estate listings. I laid them out on the table and sat with the weight of what I was about to do, not just legally, emotionally. Because evicting strangers is one thing. Evicting people who once sang you lullabies or shared your Christmas mornings is another. But I reminded myself again and again, boundaries are not cruelty. They are the conditions that make love sustainable. Sunday dinner was always their thing. Mom cooked. Lucas set the table. Nina added some Instagram-worthy garnish and lit candles like it was a lifestyle shoot. I brought the folder to the table and waited until everyone had sat down. "Before we eat," I began, my voice steady but without ceremony. "There's something we need to address." Lucas smirked. "If this is about the board, relax. It's already back in your office." I shook my head. "This is about all of it. The house, the money, the agreements we made that have been ignored." I handed each of them a copy of the notice. I watched their faces shift confusion, then offense, then the kind of stunned indignation people wear when the consequences finally arrive. "You're kicking us out?" Mom asked, eyes narrowing. "You invited us here. You said we were family." And we still are, I said quietly. But this arrangement is no longer healthy. Not for me. And honestly, not for you either. Nina barely skimmed the papers before pushing hers back across the table. You're being dramatic, she said. No court would enforce this. They wouldn't have to. I replied. Because you have 30 days. That's more grace than most landlords give. And I'm not asking you to leave with nothing. I've provided housing options. I'm offering support, but the decision is final. The next few days blurred. There were accusations, cold shoulders, whispered phone calls in rooms that weren't theirs. I stayed out of the house when I could, worked from coffee shops, took Zoom meetings from Lydia's spare room. I brought Ava, a recent design graduate I had mentored, into my next project as a trial assistant. She asked questions like someone who knew how to listen. She took notes. She respected silence. I almost forgot what that felt like. That same week, Harold called. I had an interesting email this morning, he said. A woman named Nina contacted one of our junior associates, claiming she'd collaborated on Blue Ridge, said she could consult if the contract was up for review. I closed my eyes. My chest tightened. I had no idea she'd done that. I said honestly, it won't happen again. There was a pause on the line. Barbara, I trust you, but only if you clean this up. Fast. And just like that, their actions they dismissed as harmless, nearly cost me the career I had bled for. I returned home that evening calm, resolved. I began packing. Not their things, mine, the irreplaceable pieces, the tools I needed to function. I booked a furnished short-term apartment across town, a retreat, a line in the sand. I wasn't going to wait for them to leave before I reclaimed my life. I'd leave first, but on my terms, not theirs. Because sometimes you don't win by staying. You win by stepping back, creating space, and letting the silence reveal who people truly are when you're no longer holding the weight of their comfort. The apartment was smaller than I was used to, but it smelled clean and came with keycard access and blackout curtains. It had one bedroom, neutral furniture, a decent desk, and most importantly, silence. I moved in over 3 days without telling anyone. I packed only what I needed, stored the rest in a rental unit across town, and left behind the chaos like a coat I'd outgrown. The morning I handed over the keys, the concierge smiled at me like I was just another professional starting over. He had no idea I was escaping a life I had paid for but no longer owned. Back at the house, I made one final stop to drop off the vacuum I had borrowed from Lydia. The porch light flickered when I arrived. No one came out. I let myself in and found the living room unchanged. Lucas's wires still draped across my bookshelf. Nina's diffuser clouding the air with synthetic lavender. Mom's mug half full beside a stack of coupon flyers. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a borrowed Airbnb that someone else had taken over. I walked through it without touching anything. Just looked. Then I left a note on the kitchen island I'll be staying elsewhere for the next few weeks. You still have until the 30-day mark to move, if you need help coordinating anything. I'm reachable by email. They didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. Instead, Mom sent a group message to the extended family, some vague, passive-aggressive dispatch about me taking space and how the sacrifices of parenthood often go unrecognized. I stayed silent. Let people form whatever narrative made them feel better. Because the truth was simple. I had been generous. I had been patient. And I had been erased, but not anymore. At work. Things clicked back into place like puzzle pieces that had been waiting for me to stop apologizing. Ava adapted fast. She kept my schedule tight, double-checked every document, and brought coffee without being asked. Her initiative reminded me of myself 10 years ago, when I still believed that talent was enough and politics wouldn't touch someone who stayed quiet. I watched her navigate rooms I used to shrink in, and I realized something that startled me. Maybe this version of me wasn't just surviving. Maybe I was preparing to grow. One afternoon, Harold called again. This time his tone had changed. We got the final approval on the Ridgeview phase, he said, and we want you to lead. No middle tier, no collaborative partner. Just you. I sat back in my chair. What changed, I asked, already knowing the answer. You did, he said. You stopped explaining. That's usually when the real professionals rise. Meanwhile, back at my house, the unraveling had begun. Marcus, my neighbor and a retired civil engineer with a talent for quiet observation, sent me an email. Just FYI, large boxes on your lawn yesterday. Looks like furniture being moved. Also, I saw a locksmith van. I thanked him, not with worry, but with quiet relief. The illusion was cracking. When I passed by a few days later, under the pretense of dropping off mail from a P.O. box redirect, I noticed the blinds were uneven and Nina's car was missing. A second pass confirmed what I suspected. She had moved out. Lydia called that night. They're imploding, she said. Not unkindly, it was bound to happen once you stopped being the structure. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel revenge. I just felt done, like a weight had been lifted. Not because someone else had removed it, but because I finally stopped mistaking it for mine to carry. Mom finally reached out 2 days before the deadline. Her voice on the phone was distant, tired. Lucas is struggling with the timing. Can we have an extension? I've already arranged a cleaning service for the 1st, I said. Firm, but not cruel. You've had time. I'm still offering to help coordinate moving support. But the date stands. She was quiet for a long moment. This isn't how I pictured our family ending. I let the silence hang before responding. This isn't an ending, it's a reset. And honestly, it's overdue. She didn't argue, just said she'd let me know if they needed help moving the last boxes. On the final day, I returned with a locksmith and the cleaning crew. The house was mostly empty, save for a few items in the garage and a pile of trash bags that no one had bothered to tie. The walls were scuffed, the shelves dusty, but nothing was broken. That alone felt like mercy. Marcus waved to me from his porch. You made it, he said. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I. I replied. Then I opened the door to my house and stood inside the threshold for a full minute before stepping in. It smelled stale, foreign, but it was mine again. Every corner, every line of light. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt whole. The cleaners moved quickly. I gave them instructions, then stood on the porch while the locks were changed. My hand rested on the railing I had refinished 2 summers ago, the same one Lucas chipped with his dumbbells last winter. I remembered the exact moment I decided not to say anything about it. A tiny sacrifice, a small silence, one of hundreds that had accumulated until I was invisible. Not anymore. That evening, I moved the first bag of essentials back into the house. Just one, a suitcase, a box of books, and a photograph of my father from when I was 12. He used to call me the rock of the family. I had believed him for a long time, but now I knew the truth. Rocks don't bend. I had bent until I cracked, but now I was rebuilding not into the version they wanted, but the version I needed. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a house I had bought, defended, and reclaimed not from strangers but from people I once called home, I understood something clearly. It's not about winning. It's about returning to yourself, to your space, to your standards, and building from there without apology. The first night back in my house, I didn't unpack everything, just the essentials, a few shirts, a single set of plates, my sketchbook, and a bottle of good wine I'd been saving not for a celebration, but for this specific kind of stillness. It wasn't loud. It wasn't euphoric. It was quiet in the most satisfying way. No shoes left in the hallway that weren't mine. No voices from behind closed doors. No opened mail or missing chargers. Just me, the hum of the fridge, and the creak of floors I had paid for down to the tile. I didn't need to reclaim the house with a dramatic makeover. It didn't need transformation. It needed restoration. And that's exactly what I was going to give it, starting with myself. The next morning, I woke up before the sun and opened every curtain in the house. I wanted the light to touch every corner they'd once occupied, like a quiet cleansing. I brewed my coffee and drank it in silence. No shared kitchen, no passive-aggressive small talk. just the sound of my mug on the counter and the feeling of being exactly where I was supposed to be. Ava arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. We had a meeting with Harold at 10 to review the final site plan for Ridgeview. She stepped inside, took one look at the new old version of my home, and smiled. "It feels different," she said. "It feels like you." I nodded. "It is." That meeting changed everything. Harold was impressed. Ava presented her portion with calm precision. I followed with renderings that showed not just design, but strategy. And not just strategy, but vision. The kind of vision that comes from someone no longer living in survival mode. Harold signed off on the full rollout. "I knew you just needed space to work," he said, literal and otherwise. He wasn't wrong. The week unfolded like a reset I hadn't known I needed. I began sleeping through the night. My appetite returned. My creativity, long buried beneath resentment and noise, came back with force. I revised client briefs with sharper insight. I accepted a podcast invitation from a design platform I'd declined twice before. I even met with a local arts high school to discuss mentoring young creatives. Things that once felt heavy now felt possible. Meanwhile, the fallout from my departure echoed back in pieces. Lucas had moved into a shared space across town with two roommates he barely tolerated. He posted vague complaints about people who pretend to care on social media, the kind designed to provoke sympathy without admitting failure. Nina had taken a contract position in LA and left quietly. No goodbye, no apology, just a tagged photo of her new apartment with a caption about fresh starts. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't need to. Watching them flail without access to my support wasn't satisfying. It was informative, because it confirmed what I had long suspected my absence didn't destroy their lives. It forced them to live them. Mom took longer, for weeks. There was silence. Then a letter arrived, an actual paper letter in her handwriting. It wasn't an apology, not directly, but it was something. She mentioned the new apartment, said it was smaller than she liked but quiet. She said the neighbor, a retired librarian, had invited her to a weekly book club. She enclosed a recipe card for the lentil soup I loved as a kid. "No, I'm sorry. No, you were right." But it was the first sign of a human connection that didn't require guilt as its currency. Lydia and I celebrated my return to independence with dinner at my favorite rooftop spot. I hadn't been in almost a year. She ordered 2 desserts. "You're different," she said between bites. Not louder, just taller. I laughed. "I didn't grow." She shrugged. Maybe not in inches, but definitely in spine. I knew what she meant. This wasn't just about reclaiming a house. It was about learning to take up space again in my career, in my relationships, in my own damn life. That month, I launched a new service package for my design clients' personalized live-in diagnostics. 3-day consultations where I stayed in their space, studied how they moved through it, then designed with empathy instead of just style. It took off fast. Clients were hungry for design that felt lived in, not staged. Ava managed the logistics. I handled the vision. It felt like evolution. One night, while working late, I received a message from Marcus, the neighbor who had quietly watched everything unfold. "Just saw your lights on. House looks calm. Good to see it like that again." I replied simply, "It is," because it wasn't just the house that was calm. It was me. And it wasn't the kind of calm that comes from avoidance. It was the calm that comes after you've fought for your peace and won not by force, but by refusing to be erased. I didn't reconnect with my family right away. I didn't need to. I let time do what it does best, reveal what's real when no one is performing. Eventually, I agreed to meet Mom for coffee. We sat in a quiet cafe by the river, the kind of place where people spoke in low tones and no one wore perfume too loudly. She wore her old cardigan. She looked smaller, not weak, just less armored. We didn't rehash everything. That wasn't the point. She asked about work. I asked about her book club. At one point, she reached across the table and adjusted the sugar packet in front of me, the way she used to when I was little. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. That night, as I drove home, I looked at the house waiting for me, my house, fully mine again, and thought about how far I'd come. Not just the physical space reclaimed, but the emotional terrain I'd crossed. I had walked through betrayal, not from strangers, but from the very people I thought would always have my back. And I had survived, not with revenge, not with screaming, but with stillness, strategy, and strength. Because here's the truth, the real comeback doesn't happen when they fall. It happens when you rise clean, calm, and completely uninterested in proving anything, just living, freely, in a space you chose and protected. And if you've ever had to do that, ever had to walk away from the people who once defined you, only to discover you're better without their noise, then you already know the kind of power I'm talking about. The thing no one tells you about regaining your peace is that it's not dramatic. It's not fire and applause. It's the small things that hit differently, the way you sit on your own couch without tension in your back, how your heartbeat stays steady when your phone rings, how you make dinner and there's exactly one plate to clean afterward. You notice it when there's no noise behind the silence. That's when you know it's real. About 2 months after I moved back in, I received a voicemail from Lucas. His voice was lower, slower, like someone who'd finally run out of excuses. "Hey, just wanted to check in. I'm working now. That IT gig came through. Not amazing, but it's something. Anyway, I hope you're good. Thanks for, the kick. I didn't think I needed it, but maybe I did." He didn't say sorry. He didn't need to. The fact that he called without entitlement, without expectation, said enough. Growth doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it shows up as humility over a bad connection. We met for coffee a week later, neutral ground, no tension, no agenda. He looked older, not just tired, but reflective. He didn't bring up the house. I didn't bring up the past. We talked about his new job, the absurdity of commuting by bike in the rain, and the time he got stuck in an elevator with a client and had to explain data loss recovery using vending machine metaphors. I laughed genuinely. It was the first time I'd laughed with him in almost a year. When we said goodbye, he didn't hug me, just nodded. "You're doing all right," he said. And for the first time in months, I believed it wasn't laced with resentment. Nina disappeared completely. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she'd moved on to a brand management role in Santa Monica and had rebranded herself as a digital consultant for mindfulness influencers. I didn't follow up. Some people exit your story like they entered it quick, uninvited, and best left in the past. My mother was more complicated, always had been. Her love language was duty, her default setting, stoicism. But something had shifted since the fallout. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was the distance. Maybe she had finally run out of people to project onto. Whatever it was. Her calls became more frequent, brief, but less guarded. She told me about a community garden near her new place, sent me photos of the tomatoes she was growing. She once even asked for my opinion on rearranging her apartment's furniture. The daughter she once accused of being cold just for needing boundaries. Then came the moment that caught me off guard. I had hosted a small dinner at my house for Ava's birthday. Just 4 of us. Wine, pasta, laughter that didn't demand anything. After dessert, as I stood washing dishes in the same kitchen I once felt banished from, I saw an envelope on my front step. No name, no stamp. Inside, a card, handwritten, my mother's handwriting. It said, "You were right to choose yourself. I just wish I'd known how to teach you that without needing to be the example. I see it now. That was it. No signature, no flourish, just a truth she had never spoken before. And in that quiet admission, I felt the thread of our relationship pull taut, but intact. I didn't call her that night. I didn't need to. Some things don't require immediate response. They just require acknowledgement, the next time we spoke. She didn't bring it up, neither did I. Instead, we talked about soup recipes, which book club author was too long-winded, and how she'd joined a Tai Chi group with 2 other women named Gloria. It was normal, and that felt radical in its own way. My work life continued to evolve. Harold offered me a long-term retainer. I accepted. Ava officially came on board as project lead. Together, we designed spaces that weren't just beautiful, but livable. Clients started coming to us not just for style, but for empathy, somewhere in the process. I realized I hadn't just rebuilt my business, I had rewritten my definition of success. It no longer hinged on recognition, it hinged on alignment. Did the work match my values? Did the space support the person living inside it? Did the rhythm of my days feel like my own? The media picked up one of our projects, a women's shelter that we redesigned to feel less institutional and more like a healing home. The article mentioned my name, not my past, not the family drama, just my work, and that, more than any vindication, felt like closure. Not because people knew my story, but because they didn't need to. My value no longer relied on explaining myself. It stood on its own. Later that fall, I hosted Thanksgiving. Not a large affair, just Lydia, Ava, Marcus, and two of my design interns who didn't want to fly home. As we sat around the table, I looked at the plates, each one different, mismatched but intentional. There was no centerpiece, no curated playlist, no performance, just warmth, presence, and peace. Lydia raised a glass. To choosing ourselves, she said. I raised mine back, and to not apologizing for it. After dinner, as I stood alone in the kitchen drying glasses, I realized something profound. I didn't miss the chaos. I didn't romanticize the sacrifice. I didn't long for the version of family I had worked so hard to hold on to. I honored it. I respected what it gave me, but I no longer needed to keep it at the cost of myself. That's the thing about toxic family dynamics. They're rarely built on malice. More often, they're built on unresolved patterns, unspoken roles, inherited silence. And unless someone breaks the cycle, it just keeps playing on loop. I broke it not with revenge, not with rage, but with refusal. Refusal to shrink. Refusal to fund dysfunction. Refusal to confuse loyalty with surrender. If you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel guilty for drawing a line, for choosing peace over tradition, for putting your well-being above someone else's comfort, let me tell you this. You are not wrong. You are not cold. You are not selfish. You are free, and you are allowed to stay that way. The week after Thanksgiving, I got a text from Lucas. It was short, just said, dinner sometime. No emojis, no guilt bait. Just 4 words that somehow carried more sincerity than any apology ever could. I didn't answer immediately. I gave myself time not to be petty, but to honor the space I had fought so hard to rebuild. When I finally said yes, it wasn't out of obligation, it was out of choice. We met at a low-key Mediterranean place on Hawthorne, one with dim lights and no expectations. Lucas arrived 5 minutes early, something he'd never done in the past. He looked better tired but clearer, like someone who had finally had to live inside his own decisions for long enough to recognize the weight of them. We didn't bring up the house, we didn't talk about money, or the damage, or who said what when. Instead, we talked about reality, how hard it was to stretch a paycheck, how weird it felt to buy your own toilet paper, how being a roommate with 2 strangers had made him realize what a mess he had been. I didn't get it until I had to earn it, he said, swirling ice in his glass. Everything I used to take for granted, I see it now. I didn't nod. I didn't console. I just listened, because that was enough. He wasn't here to be rescued. He was here to be real. Later that week, I stopped by my mom's apartment for the first time. She'd invited me, cautiously, with no assumptions. Drop by if you're ever on this side of town. I'll make coffee. I brought cinnamon rolls from her favorite bakery. Her place was smaller than she'd had in decades. No photos on the wall yet, furniture that didn't match, but it had a calm to it. She led me to the kitchen, poured coffee in chipped ceramic mugs, and handed me a folded dish towel for the sugar bowl. It was simple, quiet, normal. We didn't say much. She showed me her container garden on the balcony. Tomatoes, just like the ones I used to grow back at my house. I smiled when I saw them. They're not perfect, she said, rubbing a leaf between her fingers. But they're mine. I knew exactly what she meant. At work, Things moved fast. Ava took on her first full solo project. I stepped into a mentorship program for young women in architecture. Harold referred me to a major client on the East Coast. For the first time, I considered opening a second studio, not because I needed expansion, but because I had space to offer. I was no longer working from survival. I was designing from overflow. That kind of shift doesn't come with banners. It comes when you realize your energy is no longer being siphoned by people who mistake kindness for permission. The house held differently now, not just as a physical space, but as a symbol. Every corner had been retouched not with luxury, but with intention. I didn't replace the things that had been broken. I repaired them. Slowly, thoughtfully. The scuff on the floor near the kitchen door, I left it. A reminder that even beautiful things can hold memory without bitterness. My home was no longer a container for other people's lives. It was the backdrop to my own. One Friday night in early December, I hosted a small design salon in my living room. Just a handful of creatives, Ava. 2 architects, a nonprofit founder, and a photographer who'd recently gone viral for a shelter design series. We sat on floor pillows, lit candles, shared stories of burnout, recovery, rebuilding. Someone asked what had inspired the shift in my approach. I paused, then said, I had to lose my peace before I understood what it cost. The room went quiet. Not heavy, just still. The kind of stillness that meant something had landed. They didn't ask for details, and I didn't offer any, because what mattered wasn't the story. It was the message. I got a letter from my aunt a week before Christmas. She had heard the family whispers, some exaggerated, some conveniently edited, but her tone was warmer than I expected. Whatever happened, she wrote, it seems like you came out stronger. I'm sorry we weren't better supports while you were carrying so much alone. If you ever want to reconnect, I'd like to start again. That was the real aftermath, not public fallout, not confrontation, but quiet ripples of people noticing that I hadn't disappeared. I had simply redefined the terms on which I was willing to be visible. Christmas came and went. I didn't host. I didn't travel. Instead, I spent the morning hiking through Forest Park with Lydia, thermos in hand, breath visible in the cold. We talked about nothing important, and it was perfect. That evening, I made soup, watched a documentary, and fell asleep on the couch with the windows open to let the winter air in. No fights, no fake cheer, no forced traditions, just presence. That was my gift to myself, and it was the one I'd never again allow anyone to take. 1 year after the night I slept in my car, I stood at my kitchen island with a cup of tea and read through my journal from that month. The anger, the exhaustion, the self-doubt. It all felt distant now, not gone, but digested. The way you remember an illness not because it defines you, but because it taught you something vital. I had learned the difference between helping and enabling, between peacekeeping and boundary setting, between being needed and being respected. I didn't need anyone to admit they were wrong. I didn't need a medal for walking away. All I needed was to stay anchored in the version of me that didn't require validation to exist. And if that meant fewer holidays, fewer check-ins, fewer family group threads I never wanted to be part of anyway, so be it. My worth was no longer up for negotiation. Not at the dinner table, not in whispered judgments, not in texts that arrived too late. If you've ever had to choose between your sanity and your obligation, between your boundaries and your bloodline, between the version of you they remember and the version you fought like hell to become, then hear me clearly. You're not alone. You're not broken. And you're not selfish. You're healing. And healing isn't loud. It's not theatrical. It's not vindictive. It's firm, quiet, unapologetic, and absolutely necessary. There's a moment, usually quiet and unspectacular, when you realize you've stopped waiting for the apology. It doesn't arrive in a headline or a dramatic text thread. It arrives in your nervous system, when you no longer flinch at their name or rehearse what you'd say if you ran into them again. That's how I knew I had crossed the threshold. It wasn't a grand declaration. It was the way I breathed easier on Sundays, how I stopped checking who was watching my stories, how I no longer felt the need to prove that I had survived. I had lunch with Lydia at a rooftop cafe as spring began to hint its return. We laughed about the time I used to color code my fridge by personality fruit for hope, wine for stress, leftovers for surrender. She pointed at my glass and asked, "So, what's iced tea stand for now?" I shrugged. Peace. Maybe. Or just hydration. The truth was, I no longer needed metaphors. My life no longer required decoding. It was just mine again. Simple, solid. That same week, one of Ava's clients reached out to request a meeting with me directly, a luxury developer. Old money, newer taste. He had seen the Ridgeview shelter design and wanted to adapt some of our emotional planning for high-end spaces. "It's different," he said. "Your work feels like someone cared what it would feel like at 2 a.m., not just noon." That sentence stayed with me for days, because that was the difference. That's what I had earned: not more rooms, not more projects, but a seat at the table where intention mattered more than optics. Back at home, the space had started to mirror who I'd become. I'd kept the mismatched chair in the reading nook, the one Mom once said looked too casual. I kept it because it reminded me that comfort didn't need permission. I changed the lighting in the hallway warmer now, not because I was trying to create mood, but because I was no longer rushing through it. I even left one of Lucas's prints up in the studio, a bold black and white line sketch that he had drawn on the back of one of my client mock-ups. I didn't keep it out of nostalgia. I kept it because it was good work, and because forgiveness doesn't always mean forgetting. Sometimes it just means letting things live in your space without stealing your air. I started writing more privately. Essays, mostly. Reflections on design, on boundaries, on what it means to hold space both literally and emotionally. One of them got picked up by a design publication. The editor emailed me and asked, "Do you want to be interviewed for the print feature?" I paused before answering. For years, I had wanted that spotlight. Now, I wasn't so sure. I finally replied, "Yes, but not about me. Let's make it about the work, the kind that rebuilds, not just decorates." She agreed. During the interview, they asked what the hardest part of the last 2 years had been. I didn't talk about betrayal. I didn't recount the specifics of being taken for granted. I just said, the hardest part was realizing that love without respect isn't love. It's dependency. That quote made the headline. Friends texted, saying they felt seen. Strangers emailed, thanking me for saying something they hadn't been able to admit to themselves yet. I didn't reply to all of them, but I read every word. Mom called that evening. She had seen the piece. "You sound sure," she said. Not angry, just rooted. It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "I am." Then I asked about her tomato plants, and she told me they had finally sprouted again, just in time. Later that month, I went to an alumni event at my old design school. They had asked me to speak not about family or survival, but about creating emotionally intelligent spaces. I stood at the podium, looking out over a sea of young faces who still believed that creativity was enough. I didn't crush that hope. I just added to it. Design, I said, isn't just about function or beauty. It's about memory, about safety, about building places where people return to themselves, not just their belongings. The applause was quiet, respectful, like they understood. After the event, a girl, maybe 23, came up to me. "I loved what you said about returning to yourself," she said. "But what if your family is the reason you feel lost?" I looked her in the eye and replied, "Then you start with a door, a boundary, a pause, and you wait until the voice in your head sounds like yours again, not theirs." She smiled, not tearfully, just with recognition. Then she walked away. That night, I sat on my back porch with a blanket over my legs, a mug of herbal tea in hand, and no soundtrack but the sound of early spring birds in the trees. I didn't miss anyone. I didn't replay old conversations. I didn't imagine comebacks. I just sat whole, not waiting for the next thing, not rebuilding, just existing. And that's the thing no one teaches you about boundaries. Once they're built, not as walls, but as foundations, You don't have to fight anymore. You get to live. You get to choose. You get to create not from pain, but from possibility. And if someone tries to guilt you into tearing them down, you'll know, instinctively, that you'd rather lose approval than lose yourself again. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for the collapse. Not because it was fair, not because it didn't hurt, but because it showed me the full anatomy of my own strength, because it forced me to choose myself without waiting for permission, and because it gave me back the one thing I never knew I had handed away so easily, my voice. If you're still in the thick of it, still being drained, dismissed, or disguised by people who say they love you, let this be your reminder. You are not here to carry someone else's lack of growth. You are not here to fund someone else's comfort at the expense of your clarity. You are not selfish for wanting peace. You are brave for demanding it. And once you taste it, even just a little, you'll never settle for noise again. 1 year to the day after my mother said, "If you don't like living with family, you can leave." I stood in the exact same spot where I'd heard those words, the edge of my kitchen, the doorway between the hallway and the heart of my home. But this time, it was quiet. This time, I wasn't clutching a receipt in one hand and a silence full of disbelief in the other. I wasn't frozen by guilt or waiting to be seen. This time, I was at peace, not because anything had been undone, but because I had done the work of unhooking my worth from their understanding of it. I poured a glass of water, set it on the kitchen island, and just stood for a second. The tile was still faintly chipped near the stool leg. The walls bore the same pale gray I'd painted when I first moved in, long before anyone else called this place theirs, but everything felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. There's a kind of stillness that doesn't come from quiet. It comes from no longer needing to be louder than the chaos you once tolerated. My phone buzzed, a text from Ava. "The nonprofit wants to name the reading room after you. You okay with that?" I smiled. I didn't respond right away. I just looked at the message, letting the irony settle in. A year ago, my name didn't even belong to my ideas in my own home. Now, it stood for something real, something that had helped others rebuild, not just themselves, but the spaces around them. I walked over to the bookshelf I had rebuilt after Lucas cracked its corner hauling in his gaming setup. On the shelf was a photo I hadn't noticed in months, a younger version of myself at 23, holding up my first apartment lease. Beaming, hopeful, unbruised. I didn't envy her. I didn't long to be her again. I just looked at her and thought, you have no idea what you'll carry, but you also have no idea what you'll survive, and maybe that's a mercy. Later that night, I started drafting a new client proposal, nothing flashy, just another family reimagining their kitchen layout to feel less like a corridor and more like a gathering space. As I sketched, I thought about how many things are labeled open concept yet leave no room for truth. So many families pretend function equals harmony. They plan around countertops and storage, not around conversation and consent. But now, I knew better. Now, I could help others build spaces that didn't just look right but felt like permission. Around midnight, I stepped outside. The air was cold, clean, the kind of air that wakes you up without needing caffeine. I looked up. No fireworks, no signs. Just a quiet sky over a house that finally belonged to itself again. It hit me then, not all endings come with applause. Some come with exhale, with silence, with knowing that you chose the harder thing and didn't let it make you harder. A few weeks later, I was invited to speak at a community event focused on recovery through design, not recovery from disasters or war, recovery from family, from burnout, from emotional subtraction. I almost said no, but something told me this was the circle closing, so I said yes. At the event, I stood in a modest auditorium, no spotlight, just warm overhead lights and a mic that crackled if you leaned too close. The audience wasn't huge, maybe 50 people, most of them women. Some looked exhausted, others looked like they had just begun the process of rebuilding faces full of bruised strength. I didn't read from a script, I just told them the truth. I told them about this night I slept in my car. Even though I owned a house, I told them about disappearing into silence because it felt safer than confrontation. I told them about what it cost me to unlearn the belief that love always came before boundaries. And I told them what it gave me when I finally decided that peace was not something I had to earn, it was something I had to protect. Afterward, a woman in her 50s came up to me. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. My daughter moved out last year. She said, "I was angry at first, thought she was being dramatic. Now, I think she was just doing what you did. I want to reach out. I want to try again." I nodded. Start with respect, not guilt. That's the only real beginning. She nodded back, and that was it. No movie ending, no hug, just a shared knowing. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing there is. When I walked back to my car that night, I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt clean, like a story had been told without needing to hurt anyone in the retelling. Because the truth is, not all stories are meant to end with revenge. Some are meant to end with return. Not to the same version of family, but to the version of you that no longer abandons herself to belong. Now, when people ask me what changed how I came back stronger, clearer, freer, I tell them it wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It wasn't one moment. It was a choice, made every day, to pause, to listen, to walk away from noise that masquerades as love, and to never again pay for peace with silence. So here's my final question. If someone told you today, if you don't like it, you can leave, would you have the courage to walk away, not in anger, not in drama, just in full understanding that your presence is a gift, not a currency? And if the answer is yes, if some small part of you knows it's time, then maybe today is the day you don't wait for permission to begin. Because the life that honors you, the one that doesn't cost your peace just to maintain, that life is real, that story is possible, and maybe just maybe it starts when you finally say, enough.